Hi, I'm Bill, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm sober this morning through the grace of God, the fellowship, and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a lot of people like you who have taught me how to stay away from one drink, one day at a time, since April 8th of 1962. And for that, I'll be forever, forever grateful. And I know half of the room here is shaking their head saying, hell, I wasn't even born and that guy got drunk, that guy's sober. You know, you don't have to tell me that. I know that. I've just passed the point where I've gotten older than dirt, but I don't feel it. I don't feel it, you know, because in Alcoholics Anonymous, we get younger in AA. We get younger in sobriety, and I feel terrific. I really do. I really feel terrific. Although the delegate just reminded me that I have some bathroom problems myself. Since I've had prostate cancer and bladder cancer, I have to go more frequently than I realize. So if I disappear for about 5 minutes, please forgive me. All right? I want to begin by thanking June for inviting me. What a privilege it is. What a privilege it is to speak here this morning, to speak at any meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know. What's amazing is that in Alcoholics Anonymous was supposed to be humble, you know, and then they put you up here so everybody can applaud. But my sponsor says the only reason they put you up here is so that everybody out there can take your inventory, and I believe that. That's I always do that, you know. Look at that bum up there. Who the hell does he think he is? You know, I mean, it's, you know, always do that. I always do that, you know. But I can handle your applause because I am a very humble man. As a matter of fact, my sponsor says, yeah, my sponsor says I got so much humility, I'm proud of it. As a matter of fact, I was going to give my humility speech this morning, but there aren't enough people here. So anyway, I won't do that. I hope you don't mind, but you know, before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had stopped laughing a long time before that. I had my head so far up my rear end, I needed a porthole in my stomach to look out. That's where I was when I came here, you know. And today I laugh at everything, you know. No, I won't say what I was just thinking. Anyway, my wife is here, and as a matter of fact. That's my wife, Bernadette. A member of Al-Anon for 55 years. See what I had to put up with? You know? But, I was scared to death when she started coming to Al-Anon, you know, and because way back then we didn't think that we thought Al-Anon was just a secret society that got together to take our inventory, and. Which is true, by the way. Anyway, but I didn't realize they also have slips in Al-Anon. My wife had a slip last week. She was good to me. But anyway, that's. They put something in the coffee. I think that's what happened. Oh man, alive! But I want to thank you all for asking me to be here, and I really, truly, I may laugh a lot, but I'm very sincere when I say that I thank you, and because I, like you, I love Alcoholics Anonymous. It is the most important thing in my life, because without it, I wouldn't have a life, and I didn't realize that when I came here. I didn't even realize it when my sponsor tried to explain that to me, but thank God I had my sponsor, Benny, and I'm here this morning, so thank you. I'd like to begin by sharing one of my favorite stories, which I always like to tell, about these two guys, Pat and Mike, who met one day in Monahan's Bar and Grill, and they became fast friends and fast drinking buddies. And before you know it, both of them were roaring alcoholics, terrible alcoholics. In fact, it got so bad they decided to join Alcoholics Anonymous. So now they're in AA, and they're having a wonderful time in AA, and they're getting kind of long in the tooth now, 25, 30 years sobriety. And they begin to talk about, heaven, about how They found heaven on earth in Alcoholics Anonymous, which you all do, right? This is heaven, man. This is heaven. And but they wonder whether there's going to be heaven in the hereafter. So they make a pact that whoever dies first will come back and tell the other one whether there is AA in heaven. So Pat dies first. And one night Mike's in bed and Pat shows up. Like, Pat, wow. I'm going to keep my bargain, my promise, you know. He says, well, tell me, is there AA in heaven? He says, well, I got good news and I got bad news. What do you want to hear first? He says, well, give me the good news. He says, there not only is AA in heaven, it is fantastic. Meetings every day of the week. Big, these open speaker meetings. You get speakers from around the world, kings and queens and actors, famous people, and these great AA speaker meetings are fantastic. He said, well, that's the bad news. He said, you're speaking tomorrow night. My sponsor says I should stop telling that story. It's getting rather relevant, you know. Oh, man alive. Anyway, I'm supposed to simply tell my story, right? Right, yeah, what it used to be like, what happened, what it's like now, and anything else I can think of that is okay. All right. I am a very, very grateful man. Very, very grateful man. And I'm married to my wife Bernadette. We have 9 children. Well, we only had 4 when I sobered up, but then a lot of things begin to work again when you sober up, you know. So, and my kids take after us. We have 24 grandchildren. So, and it's a wonderful AA Al-Anon family. Sometimes I think some of us, anyway, including me, don't realize the power of this program that we have been so freely given and how it can change our lives so dramatically. I didn't realize that for a long time. I thought I came to Alcoholics Anonymous because I needed to be a better husband, I needed to be a better father, I needed to be a better friend, I needed to be a better worker, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought that's why God brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I found out after a while in AA that's not why he brought me here. Those are all the fringe benefits we get by being sober. That God brought me here for the same reason he brought every single person in this room here, to get sober in order to help him help another person. And that's what it's all about. It's not about anything else. And when all the people got up before me this morning, and I love to see these young people in service. It's incredible to see young people. And there weren't many young people around when I got sober, but it's wonderful to see so many coming in today. But to see them talk about being in service, and I don't think there's any greater thrill, there's any greater satisfaction, there's any greater joy than being of service to someone else. There's no way to count that in dollars. From my experience, and I know it's true from your experience too. I think so many people who just go to a meeting once in a while and go home and put the TV back on and are missing so much. And that's why, I'm still very active in Alcoholics Anonymous. You can be once you turn 49, you know. Which I did turn 49 once, I think, you know. I like to kid around and say that I used to lie. I used to say that I got sober when I was 11, but which isn't true at all. You can tell, you know. I was actually 12, you know. So, but anyway, how did I get sober? What was my life like? What was your life like? And I think it's important for us to, in order to keep the memory green, to think about it once in a while. It sure helps me be more grateful when I do. I grew up like too many alcoholics in an alcoholic home. You know, my father was a terrible alcoholic, terrible. And our family was riddled with alcoholism. My father had 6 brothers, 5 of them died of alcoholism. My father didn't because through the grace of God, he came into Alcoholics Anonymous. I was so privileged, finally, as an older man, to have a father and sober. Both of my grandfathers were alcoholics. My grandmother was an alcoholic. I mean, the whole family, both sides, were riddled with alcoholism. So, I'm Irish, German, Scotch, and French. I didn't have a damn chance in the world. Not a chance in the world, you know. It's riddled in my genes. And so why would I want to grow up and become an alcoholic? Why would I want to even pick up a drink, you know? And I didn't want to for a long time. As a matter of fact, I wanted to get out of the house, so I did. I had an opportunity when I was a very young teenager to go away to a seminary to study to be a priest. And I did. I went to the Maryknoll Fathers, and I studied for almost 5 years until they caught up to me. I thought I wanted to be a missionary priest, go to China and save all the Chinese. I don't know whatever I had against the Chinese. I mean, I like their food and all, you know, but why would I want to go and scour me with them? Or me, yeah. Anyway, I never made it to China, and of course, Father Slattery, who was my spiritual director, came to me one day and he said, "William, I've been watching you." He says, "You're very active here in the seminary. I mean, you play a lot of sports, and you're a good student. You're the editor of the magazine and all this kind of stuff, but you don't pay much attention to God, and I think you're here to learn more about God, because you got to carry God to other people if you want to be a priest." And so he says, "I'm going to watch you in your 5th year." So he watched me in my 5th year, and then he came to me and he said, "William, I think someday, Bill, you might make a wonderful, wonderful father, but not in here." So he literally threw me out in a very nice way, very nice way. The old Navy way, threw me out. And I came out into the world. Now, like so many of us, and one of the things that helped me so much in the beginning of my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous is when you shared your feelings. And because I so identified with the low self-esteem that so many of us have. I think that's typical of most alcoholics. I had it in spades when I was a kid. I never thought I was as good as, And I was a good student, I was a good athlete, I was a good at a lot of stuff, right? And most of us are, but I didn't think I was. And so I was uncomfortable among people, kids my own age. And I carried that right on through. Now I go away to a seminary. I'm away from the neighborhood for 5 years, almost 5 years. And when I come home, I'm really uptight. And I'd literally see a girl and I'd blush, Didn't last that long, thank God. But that's where I was. I was really uptight. And I got a job working for a newspaper as a copy boy. This is in 1950, and there was a heyday of journalism in New York. Believe it or not, there were 19 newspapers in the city of New York at that time. 19. Today there are 2.5. 2.5. There's the Daily News, the Post, and that brag, that New York Times thing. So you know where I come from. Anyway, but it was the heyday of journalism, and I had 2 years of college from the seminary, so I was trying to I'm going to finish up my college. So I went to St. John's University at nights and working as a copy boy. And make a long story short, I broke a story. What happened, I'll tell you very briefly. Back then, there was a crooked mayor in New York. What's new? His name was Bill O'Dwyer, and his cousin was the fire chief, okay? And they had a racket going where they were shaking down building contractors, getting large sums of money to give them permits and building licenses and whatnot. Then the FBI finally cracked it, and the mayor absconded to Mexico, and the fire chief was arrested on 99 counts of grand larceny. And I'm in my class at St. John's one night. It happened to be my ethics class. And I looked in the back room, and there's this elderly gentleman sitting there, and I had seen him before, and I suddenly realized I had seen him on the front page of my newspaper, because when he was indicted and awaiting trial. And now he's studying ethics at St. John's University. And I thought that was a hell of a story. So the following morning, I went up to my city editor just before first edition, and I told him. He didn't believe me. Then he checked it out himself, and they literally stopped the presses, and that was the headline that day. Fire commissioner indicted on 99 counts, studying ethics at St. John's University. And that afternoon, he called me over to the desk. I was 18 and a half years old, and he said, "We're making you a reporter." I said, "What?" And I had been a copy boy for about 4 or 5 months. And that's how I became a newspaper reporter in New York City, on the largest evening day newspaper in the world. At that time was the New York Journal-American. And they sent me over to Brooklyn headquarters on the lobster shift. That's midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning, which is when most important things happen in Brooklyn anyway. So, and I said to the city editor, "What do I do? What do I do?" I mean, I was honest with him. His name was Eddie Mahar, one of the greatest city editors New York had ever seen. In fact, but he was also an alcoholic who had stopped drinking on his own, gritted teeth, sobriety, And because his wife was going to leave him, they were going to fire him as city editor, they were going to, all this kind of. So he stopped drinking, and he was a very angry man. He was the only man I had ever met who could string together 17 profane words and make a perfect English sentence. I know, because he used to do it to me all the time, You, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so he said, "Bill, don't worry about it. Go over to Brooklyn," and he says, "Introduce yourself to the other reporters. They'll show you the ropes, Okay, so I go to Brooklyn at midnight, walk into headquarters, Brooklyn headquarters, and I said to the lieutenant on desk, "Where can I meet some of the reporters? I'm the new, reporter for the Journal American." He says, "Well, you'll probably find some of them over in the Edison Bar and Grill, over there in the corner of Flatbush Avenue." He was wrong. I met all the reporters over in the Edison Bar and Grill. And I walked in and I asked the bartender, never will forget, I forget his name now, but he had been a catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the reason I believed him is all of his knuckles were broken, from catching. And he introduced me to a guy named Charlie Feeney of the Daily Mirror. You got to be my age to remember the Daily Mirror. But it was a damn good newspaper. Walter Winchell was a columnist for the Daily. I'm looking at some of the younger people that's going right over their heads, I keep forgetting, Anyway, but Walter Winchell was a fantastic columnist, great newspaper. Anyway, I got to know Walter pretty well. So anyway, and so I said to Charlie, "I'm the new guy," and he knew that, because he knew I was coming. I was replacing Johnny Crosby, who had been at headquarters for 20 years. And so they were getting ready to meet the new kid on the block. And I was probably, God almighty, most of them were in their 50s, 60s, and I was just turning 19 at that time. And so Charlie said to me, "What are you drinking, kid?" And I said, "I'll have a Coke." He said, "The hell you will." And he bought me a shot and a beer. I didn't want to drink it. But here I am, surrounded by my peers, guys I wanted to be like, guys I admired. And I didn't want them to think, bad of me. I guess it's like high school peer pressure, And so I threw the shot down and chased it with a beer, almost choked to death. I remember that very well. It was sharp, sharp, sharp. Hated it. And he says, "Okay, now, kid, let me tell you." And then he started telling me about what he did. Check the teletype machine. There's something that looks interesting. Go call a precinct, etc. Then he introduced me to Joey George of the Daily News. Joe George says, "What are you drinking, kid?" And I says, "I'll have a Coke." He says, "The hell you will." Shot in a beer. Boom, shot in a beer. They passed me down the bar. They literally passed me down the bar, It was probably halfway down the bar I began to notice something. I began to notice that I was feeling pretty good. I don't know about your first drink, but mine was pretty good. And when I left the bar that night and headed back to a shack, we reporters, we worked out of a shack, which is a big long room above a greasy Greek diner, across from Brooklyn Police Headquarters. We all had a desk, a phone, and a telephone book. That was our working tools. And as I staggered back, I felt I didn't get sick, and didn't throw up, just was dizzy as hell. And we had a cot behind a bunch of phone booths in the office. I fell on the cot and fell asleep. And the next night, before I checked into you'd pick up the phone and you call the city desk, which was across the river in Manhattan, let them know you're there and you're on the job. Before I did that, I went back to the Edison Bar and Grill and got ready to go to work. And from that point on, I had no idea that I was hooked. No idea that I was an alcoholic in waiting, if you would, All I knew is that with a few drinks, I felt good. And then I began to realize that with a few drinks, I could do things that I could not do before that. I was the kind of wallflower, the guy that would stand against the wall at a dance, and watch all the other guys pick up the pretty girls. Or we'd go to Lost Battalion Hall, which was a big armory with those are the days of the big bands. And all the girls would be sitting around the tables waiting for their Prince Charmings to come in to make their selections, And I go to Lost Battalion Hall and I go into the bar to get ready to make my selection. By the time I got ready to make my selection, there wasn't much of a selection left. But whoever it was looked like Marilyn Monroe anyway, so what the hell, you know. And that's how my journey into this terrible disease of alcoholism began. It began in a wonderful, wonderful way. It opened a whole new life for me. It enabled me, as I said, to do things that I was not able to do. I thought I was a better reporter with a few drinks. I thought I was a better writer with a few drinks. I thought I was a better dancer with a few drinks. I thought I was better at everything with a few. I thought alcohol was my friend. I know that now, thinking back. I didn't think about it consciously. I don't think we become alcoholics consciously. I think it just happens. And it happened to me. And then I began to do what we all do. I began to accept the little inconveniences along the way of alcoholism, you know. And with me, it was just like a couple of small automobile wrecks, not big ones. I had 8, but most of them were very small. Like the first one I had was I ran into a telephone pole, but I was only going 25 miles an hour because the girl on my lap couldn't steer very well, you know. So I was teaching her how to drive, you know, fresh out of Monahan's saloon, right? So, but then they got worse and worse and worse. I had one serious one where I was at the city desk. They had not only my phone number at home, they had several bars that I frequented that they could reach me at. And they reached me at this Monahan's Bar and Grill one night. And the Navy Yard was on fire. And they asked me to get out and cover it. So I got in my car. And I got the half a bottle of booze that was left and a 6-pack of beer and headed down. And to go to the Navy Yard, you drive along Atlantic Avenue, and there's an elevator runs overhead. And I forgot at Bedford it goes back underground and becomes a subway. I forgot that, yeah. So I 70 miles an hour, ran into a dead-end stanchion. Boom! And the engine landed in my lap. Busted 6 ribs. One of them was sticking out, and lost some of my teeth, bit of part of my tongue. And woke up in the operating room at Jewish Hospital in Brooklyn, where I had covered many a story. Now I was covering my own. And I was there for about a week, and then I went to what alcoholics go when they're in trouble. I went back to Mommy's house, and she took care of me, and you would think I would have learned something from that. I didn't, because my friends, you know, alcoholics love to visit the sick and bury the dead as long as there's a bottle around. And so my friends would come to visit me, and my father would pass the bottle. But when he come to me, he would grab the bottle. He was still drinking at that time. And he'd say to me, "You shouldn't have any hard stuff when you're drinking." So he handed me a bottle of Christian Brothers sherry wine. And he said, "Maybe a little of this will take off the edge of the pain." Now, if you plug enough Christian Brothers sherry wine through a wired-up jaw, you get pretty sick. Now, if you ever tried to puke through a wired-up jaw, I can tell you from personal experience, the big pieces come out of your ears, you know. So I naturally did the right thing. I swore off Christian Brothers sherry wine, and I continued drinking. That's alcoholism. That's alcoholism. I'll just tell you very quickly about when you're young, and you can handle this stuff for a while, and I was able to for a while, and so and God had blessed me with some talent, blessed us all with a lot of talent, and so I began to advance in my career, and I went from police reporter to covering City Hall to covering criminal courts, general assignment reporter. And then they found out I could write. They brought me in what they call nightside rewrite, where you write the stories for the first edition. Then I found I could really write. They brought me in on dayside rewrite, where I was now writing stories for running editions. We had 7 editions of the paper. And I was on my way. By the time I was 22 years old, I was a byline feature writer for the largest evening newspaper in the world. I tell you that because that's a fact. In fact, my wife has all of my clippings to prove it. So. However, by the time I was 25, I was the obituary editor for the largest evening newspaper in the world. I got fired 5 times. 5 times. The city editor loved me. We had a wonderful relationship, Eddie and I, and I used to call him Mr. Mahar. Because he thought I had some talent, and he was trying to groom me for better things. And I kept getting into trouble. I kept getting drunk and getting into trouble. Little things, not big stuff, not big stuff. Like one night I was drinking with my friend Jimmy Helian, and we wanted to go hear some jazz music in Greenwich Village, and neither one of us had a car, so we borrowed a delivery truck from the Journal American, we forgot that it was about to take off and deliver the newspapers around the city. Instead, we took the truck into Greenwich Village and smashed 2 cars because those streets in Greenwich Village are too narrow to be driving a truck through them, you know. So. And I come into work the next day and my horse screams, "Get your ass over here." And it's like I got complaints from the drivers' union, the printers' union, the distribution union about you and your drunken buddy, you know. So he demoted me. I kept getting demoted. And so by the time I was 25, he gave me the job as the obituary editor, which is totally different than being a byline feature writer, by the way. Big difference. My job was to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning and call up funeral homes in New York to find out what well-known people dropped dead that night. And it was a kind of a boring job because I'd be talking to undertakers as they were putting new faces on the corpses, you know. And they were lonely, so they wanted somebody to talk to. And they were boring people. So what I began to do is I was spending more time over in Mucci's saloon. We had 7 saloons surrounded our paper. And one of them was Mucci's, which is my favorite. And so I'd spend more time with Frank Mucci. He owned the joint. And if you got him drunk enough, he'd buy you every other drink. And I was pretty good at getting him drunk. And so now I was tearing obituaries out of other newspapers, and I would paste them up and send them into the composing room. This is before computer type, you know. So, but now we're printing obituaries of guys who died a couple of days ago. And I was getting notes in my mailbox in the city room from my city editor saying, "We wanted fresh obits, you know." And I'm saying to Frank Mucci one night, "What the hell is a fresh obit? The bum is dead, you know, so what the hell of difference does it make, you know?" When I really got into trouble was I must have found a really old newspaper. This guy died 4 days ago, and I knew I was going to get fired finally. Yeah, they had enough of Bill. They had enough of me. They really did. And I know they did. I was just waiting for the axe to fall. You know, when you're an alcoholic and you're getting into trouble, you know. You know, I don't know about you, but I didn't want to face it, but I knew. I mean, my time was pretty soon getting up. But I had a friend of mine who was a writer for a weekly news magazine. And he liked the way I wrote, so he asked me if I'd like a job over there. So I said, sure. So I got a job working for this weekly news magazine. Made more money, bigger expense account, traveled all over the country, interviewing famous people, and getting into more and more trouble, more and more serious trouble. And what capped that job was I was sent out to Las Vegas to cover a political convention. And I got out there on a Saturday. The convention started on a Monday, and I got drunk and came to on a Wednesday afternoon in my room, drunk as a skunk, and hadn't covered the convention. But so I went downstairs to the bar because, well, you know, when you know you're going to get fired, you got to do something. So I went down and continued to drink. And there was a guy at the bar I met, a guy named Ned, never forget it, and well-dressed guy, half-loaded. And I told him what I was there for, and he said, well, I was at the convention. So I interviewed Ed, you know, and so between what Ed thought he remembered and a press kit that they had given out, you know, they'd given out press kits, you know, for this. I wrote a story, and I called it in, and I got called back an hour later from the managing editor, and he said, this is one of the best pieces you've written for us. When I got back to New York and walked into the office, he said to me, I'm sorry, but we're letting you go. Because 3 of the people you interviewed, you never interviewed. And they called us and told us. So anyway, so then I got a job in a radio. I wrote WR Radio. I was hired by WR Radio to write radio shows. But that only lasted 6 months because they have deadlines on radios. You know, if the news is supposed to be on at 9 o'clock, you can't turn your copy in at 5 after 9. You know, you got to get it in before 9. And but the guy that hired me was an old drinking buddy of mine, and he kept me on as long as he could, and then finally let me go. And then I wound up at a small public relations firm, and I lasted there. How long was I there? Maybe 3 or 4 months. And the reason I was fired there is you should never give an alcoholic an office with no windows, you know? Particularly after a 3-hour lunch, you know, because the owner of the place came into my office one afternoon, and after I came back from lunch, and he stopped at the door, and he said, thank God I haven't lit a match. And so he says, I'm sorry, Bill, I have to let you go. So, and it's gone. That's my career in the media. In the meantime, I was married. I got married to I started dating, and I met this lovely, lovely girl who was starting to be a nun. Imagine that. Yeah. But once I got into her habit, it was all over, man. It was anyway. I'm sorry. I shouldn't tell those nun jokes. I know. I'm sorry, but so anyway. But when we dated, I used to turn my collar around. See, so anyway, well, actually, we knew each other 3.5 weeks, and we eloped, and we got Elton, Maryland. We got married. Mention that 3.5 weeks. We're still getting to know each other after 62 years. Mention that. And thank you. That's Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. We wouldn't be here to 5 minutes if it weren't for AA and Al-Anon, because Al-Anon and Alcoholics Anonymous, we built a bridge back to each other, and it's been wonderful. Not always, but mostly wonderful. So anyway, so I'm married, and her mother, whom I came to hate with a passion. Oh, God Almighty! Her mother was always praying for me. Always praying for me, I don't need your damn prayers. So anyway, she gathered some money to get us money so we could put a down payment on a 2-family house in Floral Park, New York. So we bought this house. We were getting $85 rent upstairs, and our mortgage payment was only $70 a month. And I couldn't keep up the payments. I don't know about you, but this alcoholic had a lot of bad time handling money. So, and then my debts began to pile up, because for a while I became a follower of the breed, if you would, playing the horses, trying to get more money to drink on, and that kind of stuff. And I not only did I borrow from banks, I borrowed from loan sharks, I borrowed from finance companies, and at home I still have a gold key from Beneficial Finance Company. I don't know why, but anyway. But that's where it began, borrowing. And by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had 7 judgments against me, and owed all kinds of banks and loan sharks, and I was in debt for about $67,000, and didn't know what to do about it. But anyway, things got terribly worse. I told you I got to the point in 1961 where I lost a job in a PR firm, and now I was basically unemployable in the media business in New York, because people would check on me and they'd get reports like, Bill is a hell of a writer when he's around. The problem is he's not around. You can't depend upon him, that kind of thing. And then later on it became, if you want to hire him, you just watch his expense account, because he has a habit of increasing his own salary. So I used to do that too, I'm not proud of any of this stuff, but that's what happened to me. I needed to drink. And I needed to have money to drink, and I would get it any way I could. And I didn't really realize what was happening to me. But anyway, that's what was happening to me. It all came to a head in 1960, basically 61. We had to sell this 2-family house to pay off debts, bought a smaller house in Deer Park, Long Island, and the bank took that away after 10 months. And we wound up, the only place we could go was move into my mother-in-law's basement. And Bernadette's mother took us in. And it took me a while in sobriety to understand that was the grace of God. We had no place else to go, but Mama took care of her daughter and her grandchildren while this guy was out just carousing around with his terrible disease of alcoholism. And no matter what time I came into that basement, whether it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the morning, it seemed my mother-in-law was always at the dining room table. See, to get to the basement, you had to walk in the side door and pass the dining room to go down the stairs into the basement where we all lived. My wife and I. We had 2 comfortable cots behind the oil burner. They weren't that comfortable either, and the kids slept around broken cribs around the walls. And so anyway, however, by the time I came, Mama was always at the dining room table, and she was always praying. And as I said before, I knew she was praying for me, and it bothered me a great deal with my big, fat, drunken ego. And I used to say terrible things to her, and she never even looked up. Now, when I say praying, I don't mean just a few prayers. I mean, she had the New Testament and the Old Testament and the lives of the saints. So you had 2 stacks of prayer cards like that and 2 sets of rosary beads. That's a prayer, right? That's a prayer. And I didn't know it until I got sober that she prayed me right into Alcoholics Anonymous. But I didn't like it at the time, and I used to tell her that. And she never said a word. She just kept on praying. It was in March of 1961, I got a phone call. My wife never knew where I was at this point. I was always out trying to borrow more money to do more drinking. But this particular day, I told her where I was going. Some guy wanted to see me about some deal. And so I was going to some club in Manhattan. And our oldest daughter, Judy, who was then about four and a half, got a serious infection in her kidneys and had to be rushed to the hospital. And so Bernadette reached out to me, begged me to come to the hospital. By the time I got to the hospital, I was 3 sheets to the wind. I was so drunk I fell out of the cab, and Bernadette looked at me and started crying hysterically, and she begged me not to go into the hospital. On the way home, we stopped off at a Chinese restaurant. Never will forget this, parts of it anyway. And we sat down. Bernadette told me I ordered 9 drinks all at once. Now, I had stopped ordering single drinks because bartenders are too slow for alcoholics, you know. Because by the time you finish your drink, they're at the other end of the bar serving somebody else. You got to order 2 or 3 at a time at least to get, just to make up for the distance. And but this time she said I ordered 9, and I believe her. And she looked at me, and I do remember this because she had done it a couple of times before, and I hated it. She looked at me and she said to me, "Why?" Remember that question? Why? Why are you doing this to yourself? At this point, I weighed about 320 pounds, big, fat, sloppy, sweaty, drunk, hadn't taken a shower in a couple of days or more. And here I am sitting in front of my lovely wife. And she says, "Why? Why are you doing this to yourself?" And for the first time, I just broke down. Not crocodile tears. I was scared to death because I have an answer to that question. I never had an answer to that question. And she said to me, "Why?" And I reached out and I said, "Bernadette, there's something wrong with me. I think I'm going crazy, and I don't know what to do about it." See, I used to come to out of blackouts in some of these flea bag saloons in Manhattan with the store sawdust on the floor and the spit tunes and remember, there were shortcuts to the men's room. And then it would hit me. It would hit me. Here I am, 27 years old, don't have a job, deeply in debt. I hadn't filed income tax in 8 years, and what's going to happen? And then I just drink more to get rid of the fear, And so now she's asking me why, and I reached out and I said, see, because my answer in those instances in these bars was that I was going crazy. I was going crazy. There was only no other explanation. I couldn't explain why I was doing what I was doing and doing it over and over and over again, things I didn't want to do over and over again. Except you got to be crazy to do that. So Bernadette is a lovely, soft-spoken lady, but underneath it, she's a lady of action. She doesn't believe that you just rest your head on her shoulder and she pets you to death. She believes you take action. If there's something wrong, you do something about it. Simple as that, right? So she called our family doctor. And she said, "Doctor," she told me this. She said, Dr. Altruda was his name. She said, "My brother-in-law is having a serious problem." The shame. And the doctor said, "What has that bum of a husband done now?" And she told him, and he made an appointment for me to see a psychiatrist the following Saturday afternoon. So the following Saturday afternoon, I head for the psychiatrist's office. His name was Dr. John Brancato, a little skinny guy with a pencil mustache and half glasses. But on the way, I stopped off at Fred Funk's Saloon to get ready. You got to get ready for these big things in your life. You're going to see a psychiatrist, man, you got to get ready. That's a big deal, And so I don't know, I had 4 or 5 shooters, double shots. And so by the time I got to his office, I was ready, And I looked around for the couch. In the movies, you lay on the couch, right? And you tell him how your father beat you and all this kind of stuff. And there was no couch. So I got worried. Maybe he wasn't a real psychiatrist. Instead, he points me to a chair right in front of his desk. So I sit down in the chair, and I'm looking up at him. And he says, "Why are you here?" I said, well, then my doctor called you. Didn't he tell you? He said, well, no, you tell me. I said, and he said, by the way, what's your name? I said, Bill. Bill, how old are you? I said, I'm 27. He said, oh, okay. You're here at a psychiatrist's office at 27? What the hell's wrong with you? So I said, I think I'm going crazy, or I am crazy, or something. He said, why? And I began to share some of the stories that that I haven't told, I don't tell a big drunk a lot, but, coming to on a train, for example, and during rush hour, I came to, and there was nobody standing around me. They were all packed the other side of the car, staring at me like I was some kind of a freak. And then I looked down, I had puke from my chin down to my navel, and that kind of stuff. And so he stopped me and he said, oh, I see. He said, you drink a lot, don't you? And I didn't know why he asked me that question. I wanted him to ask me, why do you think you're nuts, And I said, well, what do you mean by a lot? He said, well, let's you and I figure that out, So I, okay. He says, what do? You drink beer with your friends on weekends? I said, yeah. He said, you ever drink beer on Mondays or Tuesdays? I said, yeah. You ever drink beer on Wednesdays, Thursdays, or Fridays? I said, yeah. He said, ever drink anything else like rye? I said, yeah, I like rye. How about scotch? I said, well, that's an acquired taste. And he said, how about bourbon? I said, bourbon and water. I love bourbon and water. It's a really good drink. How about gin? Yeah, gin in the summertime. I like gin. Yeah. Vodka? I like vodka too. Vodka's very good. He said, how about wine? I said, well, I don't drink Christian Brothers sherry wine. I said, yeah. I gave that up, so. But what he was doing, he was painting a picture of a guy who was 27 years old who drank every day in the week, anything he could get his hands on, right? And then he said to me, do you know what an alcoholic is? And I straightened up because I knew the answer to that. And I said, I sure do. And I described a guy sitting on a curb in a Bowery, picking lint out of his navel while drinking booze in a brown paper bag. That's an alcoholic. And that was always my vision of an alcoholic. And he said to me, Bill, that guy wasn't born on a Bowery. He's probably born in a nice place like you, maybe in a even nicer place like you. And through the use and abuse of alcohol, he wound up on a Bowery, and then he's in the final stages of his disease. And I said, wow, that's something. Poor guy. I said, He said, but now let's talk about you, And then he began to talk to me about the disease of alcoholism and how it affects us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And as he began to talk, I began to get a sense that he was insinuating, that I was an alcoholic. I wanted to punch the bum right in the mouth. I really did. I'm saying to myself, who the hell does this guy think he's talking to? Here I came out of the goodness of my heart, and he's sitting there insulting me, So when he got all finished, he said to me, Bill, if you are an alcoholic, and I think you are, he said, there's no way I can help you. He says, psychiatry can help active alcoholics. If you get sober, something different, I can help. But I said, what should I do? He says, well, if you really want help, and he went through the Rolodex, he wrote down the phone number of the Intergroup office of AA, and he said, if you really want help, call these people up. And so I said, okay. And I went home. Stopped off at Fred Funk's Saloon for a few more shooters. Of course, now I got to face the wife, right? How do you go home and tell your wife that a psychiatrist thinks you're an alcoholic? How the hell you do that, With my kind of pride, Anyway, so I went home and she sat on one cot, I sat on the other cot behind the oil burner. And she said, what did he say? She was very, I said, well, you got to understand. I said, what did he say? I said, he said he thinks I'm an alcoholic. No. What did he say? I said, well, you got to understand. He thinks I'm an alcoholic, but you have to understand what he means by an alcoholic. She said, what does he mean? So I paraphrased, And I said, he said, an alcoholic is usually somebody, first of all, is usually very intelligent. No, I think he said that. I'm not positive, but I think he said that. Anyway, but he did say, he said, but an alcoholic is also very sensitive. And what happens is they get upset, they have to reach for a drink. See? So he told me to tell you to stop yelling at me from now on. And to tell your damn mother to lay off me too, so. And she's still sitting there looking at me, And she said, well, what does he want you to do? I said, he wants me to go to something called AA. And so help me God, this is exactly what she said. She's sitting there. You can get it. She said, how is American Airlines going to help you? Yeah. I said, no, honey, it's not American Airlines. I said, it's something called Alcoholics Anonymous. It has to do with drinking. Oh, drinking, yeah, then you're going to go, right? So I went over to New York, and now I love my higher power. My higher power is the closest thing to me in this whole world. I have a deep belief in God, and I turn my will and my life over to God every single day. Back then, it was not the case. Back then, God and I were on the outs. I believed there was a God. I think he didn't want anything to do with me. But he always did, and he always does, and he's always there for us, and you know that as well as I do. That all we got to do is give him a little opening, and he'll be there. So I go to AA office, and God is there waiting. And how does he express himself? I'll tell you how. This big guy, John, was at the desk. And I never forget, he had a beautiful tweed jacket, and he had a handlebar mustache. I saw somebody today with a handlebar mustache. Huh? Where is he? Yeah, I love that mustache. That's what John had. He had this big wax mustache. And he looked like he was about 6 foot. He stood up, about 6'8", and I thought he was wearing a catcher's mask when he shook a catcher's glove when he shook my hand. His hand was so big. He said, my name is John. I'm an alcoholic. You got a problem with alcohol? I said, no, John. I said, no. I said, not me. I said, but there's a psychiatrist back in Queens that thinks I do, and he wants me to come over and get some information. Sounds so stupid, doesn't it? He said, oh, you want some information? I said, yeah, I want some information. I'll tell you what, I'm going to take you to an AA meeting tonight. Get all the information you want, okay? You come with me tonight. This is a Saturday. I said, geez, John, I don't know. I'm kind of busy tonight, you know. I don't know, why is Saturday night such a busy night for drunks? I don't know. He said, that's all right. Now here's where God comes in, okay? John reaches into his wallet and pulls out his business card, and he hands it to me. And he says, I'll tell you what, anytime you want to go to a meeting, just call me up, and I'll take you. Thank you, John. I head for the door. Get close to the door, just glance at the card, and it says, John so-and-so, Vice President, Chase Manhattan Bank. And I was running short, you know. I said, geez, I ought to get to know this guy, you know. And that's how God got me to my first AA meeting. I don't know how he got you there, but he works in very strange ways. But it didn't take. I wish I could say it took. You know, there's a bunch of old fogies like me sitting around swapping war stories in the Woodhaven group in Queens, and I listened to them for about 2.5 months. And I didn't drink that much. I guess they told me not to, but every once in a while, but not too much. I was trying to give it a real good shot, you know. So I come home after 2.5 months, and I said to Bernadette, I'm glad I went to AA because I don't have to go anymore. She says, why not? I said, because I learned all I needed to learn. She said, well, what'd you learn? I said, I learned that if I ever kept drinking the way I was drinking, someday I could have a lot of trouble. I couldn't get a job. I'm living in a basement, sleeping on the cot behind the old Bernadette. Our kids are in broken down cribs, and and Bernadette looks at me, and remember The Exorcist, where the head spins around? So he's going to get more trouble? Oh, God. So I started drinking again. And the first week of April of 1962, I came to in a Fleabag hotel just off the Bowery, near Sammy's Bowery Follies, if anybody remembers Sammy's Bowery Follies. And it was, the place stunk, smell of urine and stale beer and smoking. And I had a 4 or 5 day growth of beard which is stuck to the mattress because I had vomited in my sleep. And I walked into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and I just so disgusted. I opened the window and I climbed out. I was on the 8th floor of the old Margarita Hotel, which is now a police station, strangely enough. And I decided it was the end. I was 28 years old. I now had 2 DAs looking for me on bad check charges because they kept writing bad checks. As I said before, I had a lot of deep debts, and I just thought it was all over. But for some reason or other, I just couldn't let go. And that was God again. You know, I found out that I didn't want to really die. I just didn't know how to live. I had no idea how to live my life. But I crawled in and I said, I'm going to go do something good. I'm going to go and leave my wife and family for good. They'll be better off without me. You know, the old self-pity crap we have, you know. And so I go into the basement when I came home and Bernadette, I don't know if she was ironing. And I said, I'm going to do you a favor and get out of your life for good. And she said, okay, fine. And she said, but before you do you think you owe me one last favor? I said, I guess so. She says, for God's sakes, Bill, why don't you give AA another try? A woman who I thought hated me. I really did. I thought she hated me. I know my children were afraid of me. They would see me, they'd put their hands up, you know. Terrible. And I couldn't handle what she said, so I ran out. Ran 2 blocks down to City Line, into a bar, ordered 2 double shots, got 1 down, and then looked in the mirror. I never will forget this. I looked in the mirror. And the one thing about mirrors is they don't lie. You look in the mirror and you see the truth. And I knew I couldn't go any further, and I didn't want to go any further anymore. So I turned around and went back home to Mama's house, took a shower in her bathroom. Meantime, Bernadette had found some cards that some guys had given me the year before, and she called a guy named Joe when I got back home. And when I came out of the shower, the phone was ringing, and it was Joe calling me on the phone. And he said, I hear you're having a lot of problems again, Bill. Would you like to give AA another try? And I said, please, Joe, please. And that Monday, April 8th of 1962, a big old Packard, blue Packard, pulled up. I don't know if anybody remembers the old Packards. I mean, you could sit 8 people, including 4 fat people, in a Packard, because I know that because there were 3 fat people before I got in it, you know. And it was driven by a guy named Benny Michelson from Woodhaven, Queens. And the greatest man I've ever met in my entire life. And he helped, along with God and you, save my life. He was driving. And we got to the meeting, and I said to Benny, what do I do? He says, just sit down and listen. And you can't listen with your mouth open, so just keep it closed and listen. And after the meeting, somebody said to me, Bill, you got to get a sponsor. So I asked Benny, and Benny said, I'll tell you what, let me think about it. In the meantime, come with me. And he brought me into the kitchen. And back in those days, you know, we used to drink coffee out of mugs. You know, you can't get sober drinking coffee out of these damn styrofoam cups, you know. Nothing to wash. And we used to wash the mugs, wash the knives and forks. We used to have cake plates, you know, all that kind of stuff, you know. And so he filled the sink up with hot, soapy water. He said, you wash, I'll dry. And I know I'm going to sound melodramatic when I say this, but it always pops up in my mind, so it must be some truth to it, that when I put my hands in that hot, soapy water, I began to feel different. I began to feel good. And I know now what it was. It's service, right? It's doing something for somebody else. And I hadn't done that in such a long time. Something happened, you know? And being at that meeting and being with Benny and some other guys, these other 3 fat guys, and I felt safe. You know that safe kind of feeling we get at AA, you know? And anyway, on the way home, Benny dropped all the other guys off first and then drove me home. And we got to the door, and he said to me, I've decided to be a sponsor. I said, thanks, Benny. He said, yeah, once you decided that you were going to work with me to wash those dishes, you committed yourself. And so now I'll be a sponsor. And over the course of the next couple of years, Benny took me through actually over the next 7 months, Benny took me through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he said I needed to get through them because I was a walking garbage can with the top ready to blow off. So he needed to get it cleaned out quick in a hurry. And I began to do that. And my life began to change. Got a small job. We moved upstairs in Mama's house to a 3-room apartment. 4 kids in a 3-room apartment, but it was like heaven. And couldn't get a decent job in New York. But I got a call one day from a friend of mine, an executive with a public relations firm, who I don't know why he was still my friend. He was just such a good, decent man. And he asked me if I'd be interested in taking a job in a place called Nashville, Tennessee. And I had never heard of Nashville, Tennessee, to be honest with you. And so he said it's a well-paying job, and they need a director of public relations down there, and I think it'd be a good spot for you. So I asked Bernadette about it, and she said I'll have to think about it. So she talked to her mother, and Mama had seen what had happened to me over the 7 months, and said to Bernadette, yes, if you don't have faith in Bill, have faith in God. And maybe God, this is what God's giving him a chance. And she had the courage to move with me to a town nobody had ever heard of, away from her family, away from her mother. And we began a whole life all over again. Sober life, and it was fantastic. It was fantastic. And we had 5 more kids. And that was fantastic. Anyway, just 2 quick stories about Nashville. First thing was I worked in a building right in the middle of town, and there was only 3 meetings, 3 groups of AA in all of Nashville, Tennessee. There was the downtown group, there was a luncheon group in a church about 3 miles out of town, and there was the East Nashville group across the river. So I was always going to the main group downtown. But I began to worry because it was right in the heart of town, and I was afraid that somebody might see me, somebody from the company might see me going to AA and report me to the president, okay? Because I was working directly with the president of the company. And I got very fearful. And so I didn't know what to do, so I called my sponsor, Benny, back in New York, because I hadn't gotten a sponsor yet in Nashville. Then I said to Benny, what should I do? And he said, Bill, I've always told you that the only way you can live in sobriety is naked. You have to live with no secrets. You cannot be afraid of anybody finding out anything, because otherwise you're going to wind up getting drunk. I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, who you report to? I said, the president of the company. He said, well, go tell him you're in AA. I said, you got to be kidding. I mean, hell, I got my wife and my kids down here, and we got nothing except this job. And if I lose this job, what have I got? He says, do you still have God in your life? I said, I don't know, I guess. He said, not. He said, you're still turning your will in your life over to him every morning? I said, well, in words, I guess. He said, well, then do it in deeds. Trust in God, trust in AA, trust in me. So the following day, I made an appointment to see the president of the company. I never forget it. Somebody asked me before I get up here to speak if I was nervous. And I said a little bit. That's. But I'm wearing a diaper just in case. Anyway, it's and that's the way I felt. That's the way I felt that morning, and going into his office. And his name was Guilford Dudley Jr. Never forget it, Guilford Dudley Jr. He turned out to be one of the finest men I had ever come to be friends with. And I said, Mr. Dudley, I got to tell you something. And he said, well, what do you have to tell me, Bill? I said, I hate to tell you this, but I said, I'm an alcoholic. And he leaped up from his chair. What? He said, you're what? I said, well, wait, but I said, I'm an Alcoholics Anonymous and I'm sober, but that's what I am. And I have to tell you because I don't want anybody else to find out before you knew. And he took a deep breath and he said, oh, you're in AA, you're sober in AA? He said, yeah. I said, yeah. He said, that's great, he said. I got a lot of friends sober in AA. He said, and I apologize for reacting the way I did, but do you know who you replaced in this job? I said, no, who do I replace? He said, a guy named Harry Bonte or something like that. And he says, he was an awful alcoholic. And he said, the reason I had to fire him is he look out the window. He says, those trees down there in the atrium, at noontime, he was constantly urinating on those trees, He says, as long as you don't urinate on those trees and you keep going to AA meetings, you got no worry with me. So we got to trust God and trust Alcoholics Anonymous, trust our sponsors, That's the way it works. And the other quick story is I hadn't filed income tax in over 8 years. And I was constantly worried that the next knock on the door was going to be from a federal guy with chains to haul me off to jail, And one night I'm at a meeting, and a guy named George, what was his name again? George. Well, anyway, you were very good friends with him. Anyway, no, he was like a father. He was like a father kind of guy, And he said, there's something on your mind, isn't it? And I finally said, yeah. I said, I hadn't filed taxes, and I'm afraid, blah, blah, blah. He says, I got a friend of mine who might be able to help you. So next thing I know, I'm having lunch with a guy named George and this guy named John, and John said, well, just gather together all the information you got, whatever bills and whatnot. I said, I don't have any. He said, anytime I got anything, I just threw it away. He said, that's the way alcoholics usually handle things, You get a letter from the IRS, you throw it away. Yeah, that's what you do, And so he said, he took out a piece of paper and a pencil, and he said, well, just tell me, where did you work, what years, and so on. He took out all of my work history, And he said, I'll give you a call. About a week later, I get a call from this guy, John. He said, I want you to meet me at my office. And I said, okay, where are you? He says, I'm in the government building on Main Street or something or other. And on the second floor, door 101. I walk in the door, and on the door it says, Director, Tennessee State Income Tax, IRS. This guy's the head of the IRS in the state of Tennessee. And he's a friend of George's in Alcoholics Anonymous. Talk about God? Oh, man. So I walk into his office, and he gets a very serious face. Sit down. So, and now I figure I'm definitely going to jail, right? I don't care who the hell this guy is. He's going to send me to jail. And he said, there's a serious problem not filing your income tax in 8 years. He said, there are penalties for that. It's against the law. It's penalties. So we got to have to charge you penalties for 8 years. But you don't realize that with the times that you worked and you got a paycheck, IRS took money out of your paycheck. So you pay taxes over those 8 years. So right now it looks like the government owes you $1,600. Oh my God. Alcoholics Anonymous, what do you say? Anyway, I was offered another job in Cleveland, Ohio. Big step up, and we now had a bunch of kids that needed educations and college and all that kind of, we had a plan. Excuse me. So I took that job, and it's in Cleveland that I met some businessmen, very wealthy businessmen, and we became good friends. They weren't in AA, good friends, and they decided, why should I be working as a director of public relations? Why shouldn't I start my own firm? And they put up money and started me in business in New York. So I opened up a public relations company, communications company in New York City, and I began to handle some big clients that they brought to me. And before you know it, I had a very thriving firm. I was handling a lot of financial relations for companies. I was making corporate films for companies, and I was doing all that kind of stuff. And still very active in Alcoholics Anonymous. And anyway, I make a long story short, an investment banker that I came to know came to me one day, and he said, Bill, I like the work that you do, and he said, I'm putting together a new company, and I was wondering if you'd like to be part of it. I'd like you to be part of it. And I said, what's the company? He said, I'm putting together an independent motion picture production company. And I got 3 guys, but I need somebody who really knows story. And I know your background because I've checked on you with a number of people, and you know story. You know how to write stories. You know what's a good story. You know how to make a good movie. So I said, why don't you meet these 3 guys and see what you think? So I did, and I liked them. They were 3 good guys. And I became the 4th partner in the company called Artists Entertainment Complex. This is in 1971. And before you know it, we're making movies. Something I'd always dreamed about. Of course, when I was drunk, I used to dream about making movies. The first movie we made was with somebody that the younger people don't know, but maybe somebody with my color hair does, with a gal named Raquel Welch. Yeah. She's still around, and she's as beautiful as ever. And we made a movie called Kansas City Bomber, where she played a roller derby queen. And watching Raquel Welch skate around this arena with these tight-fitting black leather pants was like having a spiritual experience, So I fell in love with the business, so then we, a friend of mine, Peter Morse, somebody have met, maybe some of you read some of his books. He's a marvelous writer, Peter Morse. And he and I, he was with the Herald Tribune when I was with the Journal American, and we had covered something called the Knapp Commission, which was an investigation of dirty cops in New York. And the undercover cop was a guy named Frank Serbico, who the cops tried to kill twice. And he had fled. He was living over in Switzerland. And Peter went over to Switzerland and got his rights and was writing a book about Frank. And so we were having lunch one day, and I told Peter about our independent motion picture production company, and why don't we make a deal, you know? And Peter said, fine, if you can pull it off. So we got a guy named Dino De Laurentiis. Somebody might have heard of that name. He was a big film financier. And he said, if you get a young actor that I like, then I'll finance the movie for you. And there was a young actor who had just made his first movie called Panic in Needle Park, a guy named Al Pacino. And so we got out and played, he played Frank Serbico, and we made a movie called Serbico. The thing I remember most about that is 8 o'clock every morning before we went on the set, Al would show up with 5 cold pizzas and a case of Coca-Cola, and that was breakfast every morning, every morning. Crazy, 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 crazy. Great guy, great guy. Greater today than he was back then for a lot of different reasons. Anyway, so we made Serbico. That put us on the map. And then we used to meet every Friday to discuss, you know, ideas. And my partners would drink their martinis, and I was finally able to now drink a Coke. And so one day, one of my partners had a tear sheet from Life magazine about a young guy who had just robbed a bank in Brooklyn to get his buddy a sex change operation. And my partner thought it'd be a great, great story. It wasn't my cup of tea, but I thought it could be a good movie. And it turned out to be a movie called Dog Day Afternoon, also starring Al Pacino. So, in the meantime, we're back in New York. My wife is going to Al-Anon. She goes to a picnic up at a place called Stepping Stones, and she meets Lois Wilson. And she invites me up to meet Lois. And so I go up to Stepping Stones, and one of Lois's friends shows me around the house. And I'm sure many of you have been in Stepping Stones, right? Right. And upstairs, Lois created like a museum of AA and Al-Anon, you know. The desk where she founded Al-Anon, all the pictures of the early members of AA. And back then, there were albums filled with cards from people from all over the world thanking them for saving their lives. I mean, it was such a moving experience. So by the time I came downstairs, I said to Lois, Lois, I want you to know I'm a big shot movie producer, Lois. Because my ego was beginning to slowly, you know, creep out of my pores. And sometimes that happens to us without us realizing it, you know. And it was happening to me without my realizing what was happening to me, you know. And so I said, you know, I said, this would be a fantastic movie. Would it be all right if we made a movie about what you and your husband accomplished? And she said, well, Bill, this is the first time we've met, so maybe we ought to get to know each other a little bit first. She said, I love Bernadette. Bernadette and Lois became very close friends over the 15 years that we knew her before she passed away. Bernadette used to drive her all over the place. They used to go to lunch at night, and then they'd come down to New York, and I'd take them to shows in New York. And it was just a marvelous, marvelous relationship. And then Lois finally transferred her faith in Bernadette to me and allowed me to bring a tape recorder up to her home. And she began to share with me her whole life. From the time she first met Bill on a lake in Vermont, and to the time she was so angry that she was not with him holding his hand when he passed away. She wanted to be with him when he went over, she said. And Bernadette was with her the day she passed away. But anyway, she gave me permission. I wrote a script. And make a long story short, I took the script out. I had a connection with Columbia Pictures because a director of Columbia in New York had become a friend of mine. And his nephew was running Columbia in California, a guy named Peter. And he said, go out and see Peter. I'll call him up and tell him I think he ought to do this movie. So I took my script out, and Peter said, I'll read it over the weekend. I'm going to send you and your wife to Vegas on me and have a good time. When you come back, we'll make a deal. So I come back, and Peter said, you know, I read your script, and it's a good script, but we got to make some changes. It's not sexy enough. He said, we got to have this guy, Bill, this big AA guy, we'll have him running bare-ass naked up and down hotel hallways, chasing broads, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, really get into it, you know. And I said, but that's not the story. I said, this is a spiritual story. He said, well, I don't make spiritual stories. They suck. So, you know, no matter what, it's hard walking away from a deal. But I had promised Lois that I would tell the truth of the story, and the truth of the story would be made. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. So I took the script, put it back under my arm, and came back to New York, and we were all disappointed. Make a long story short, my sponsor said to me, look, since you're so down, you got to get back and really active again in Alcoholics Anonymous and forget all of this other stuff. So I got involved with a place called Casa Serena. Some of you maybe remember Casa Serena, Joe LaPiccolo, and his Friday night spaghetti dinners. And so I got involved with Joe, and I used to go up there every day and just talk to the drunks. And I had a wonderful time talking to the drunks. The big book says, you got a problem, go work with somebody. And I did. And it put my feet back on the ground. And the cook at Casa Serena, this guy named Ed, and he asked me to be his sponsor. And on his first anniversary, he asked me to speak, and I did. And he came to me and he said, you know, Bill, you've been telling me that I probably won't be a cook here the rest of my life, that I got to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, and I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Hollywood and become an actor. And I was fearful that some of my background had, influenced. And I said, if you decide to do that, make sure that the day you get off the plane, you get a sponsor, go to a meeting, and get settled in AA before you do anything else. He said, I will, don't worry. But he said, before I leave, can I take your script with me? Just in case I bump into somebody out in Hollywood who wants to make your movie. I said, absolutely, Ed. I said, that's how movies get made. A cook from a rehab goes to California, and one day he's sitting in a greasy spoon diner, and a producer walks in, and the guy says, I got a great script. And the producer says, I've been waiting for that all of my life, and he makes the movie. See? Now, and then I apologize, Ed, for being so sarcastic, And but we all laugh, because that's not the way you make movies, unless you're God. And that's the way God makes movies, because that's how this movie got made. Ed takes my script out to California. And one Saturday night, we're sitting home, and we're watching Archie Bunker. Remember Archie Bunker? And Archie Bunker's house gets burglarized. And so two detectives show up. You know who one of them was? Ed. I said, Bernadette, there's Ed. There's Ed. She says, oh, my God, yeah, that's Ed. About a week later or so, we're watching Sanford and Sons. Remember the junkyard show, And the junkyard catches fire. And 3 firemen come charging in with a hose. You know who the lead fireman was? Ed. Hey, Bernadette, there's Ed again. He was going around Hollywood, knocking on doors and getting parts in some of these shows, Then one day I got a call from Ed, and he's very angry, and he said to me, I just found out that somebody out here is trying to steal your movie. I said, what do you mean trying to steal my movie? He said, they're trying to make a movie about AA. I said, anybody can do that. There's a lot of information they can use in moving about. He said, no, but you knew Lois, and Lois gave you permission, blah, blah. He said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, he says. I said, okay, Ed, good. Ed did have a very strong personality, by the way. So he finds out there's a company called Garner the Show, and he finds out, and he gives them my script. They love my script. I get a call from them, and Peter the Show, James Garner's partner, flies in, and he says, would you be willing to rewrite this for television? And I said, sure, why not? And I did, and that's how the movie, My Name is Bill W., came to be. That was God. It's God. And I had all these notes from Lois, and so Bernadette convinced me to sit down one day and write a book about Lois. I wrote a book about Lois called When Love Is Not Enough. That's what she always talked about. And then we made a movie with Winona Ryder and called When Love Is Not Enough. I'm going to close now, and you can share. I'm sharing all of this because if there's anybody here that has a dream, please hang on to it. Please nurture it, because it'll happen. It'll happen. If God wants it to happen, it'll happen. And in closing, I want to just bring back my mother-in-law. We were having another baby, and Mama flew down to I flew her down to Nashville to take care of Bernadette and the kids. And one night, after Mama tucked Bernadette and the kids into bed, I'm in the den doing some writing, and Mama comes by with all of her paraphernalia. And she sits down next to me on the couch and she puts her stuff down and she looks up at me and she says, you know, Bill, she says, all of my life I say all of these prayers and I read the New Testament and read about all the miracles that Jesus Christ performed. And then I read the lives of the saints and I read about all the miracles that the saints performed. And she said, I've often wondered what it would be like to see a real miracle. And then she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, and now I have. She saw the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous in my life. And that's what you see when you stand up here.